He gave the order from a hospital bed, and 3 states went silent. They said he was finished. Rumors spread through Jalisco like wildfire. El Mencho was dying, his body failing, his empire vulnerable. And in that moment of perceived weakness, someone made a move. According to intelligence reports, what happened next wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was something far more unsettling. From a location investigators still can't confirm. Some say a private clinic, others a fortified ranch. A single message was sent. No shouting, no threats, just names. And within 72 hours, the cartel world understood something it had somehow forgotten. El Mencho doesn't need to stand to make men fall. The order he gave that day didn't just eliminate rivals. It rewrote the rules of power itself. But here's what no one expected. The target wasn't his enemy. It started the way these things always do. A whisper. A name spoken too quietly in the wrong room. A question no one dared ask out loud. Until suddenly, everyone was asking it. Is El Mencho dying? According to intelligence reports compiled by Mexican security agencies, the rumors began circulating in late 2022. Some sources placed their origin in Guadalajara. Others pointed to Mexico City, perhaps leaked from a hospital, perhaps planted by rivals hoping to accelerate what nature had supposedly started. The details varied. Kidney failure, some said. A degenerative condition affecting his mobility. Cancer. No 2 accounts agreed. But they all carried the same implication. The most powerful cartel leader in the Western Hemisphere was running out of time. And in this world, a world where perception is power, that implication was enough. Enough to make phones ring in Sinaloa. Enough to make men in Michoacán start counting soldiers. Enough to make certain lieutenants within CGNG itself begin asking a question they had never dared ask before. What comes after? You see, El Mencho had built something unprecedented. Not just a cartel. Not just a trafficking network. An empire. From Jalisco to Colima. From Guanajuato to Veracruz. According to the DEA, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel had become the single most powerful criminal organization in Mexico, surpassing even the fragmented remnants of Sinaloa. And at the center of that empire stood one man. A man who rarely spoke. A man who never appeared on camera. A man whose face most of his own soldiers had never seen. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. El Mencho. But power built on fear has a weakness. Fear requires presence. It requires certainty. It requires the constant, unspoken reminder that consequences are not theoretical, they are inevitable. And when rumors began to suggest that El Mencho might be confined to a bed somewhere, unable to walk, unable to command, unable to see what was happening in his own territory, that certainty began to crack. The first signs were subtle. A shipment delayed in Manzanillo, not by authorities, but by internal confusion over who had authorization to move it. A plaza boss in Zacatecas who suddenly stopped answering calls from Guadalajara. A meeting in Tijuana between mid-level CGNG operators and representatives from a rival faction. A meeting that, according to intercepted communications, should never have happened. None of it was open rebellion. Not yet. But it was movement. The kind of movement that happens when predators sense weakness in the pack leader. Investigators believe that El Mencho was aware of every single shift. Every hesitation. Every unanswered call. Every quiet conversation held in parking lots and backrooms. Because that was the nature of his system. He had built CGNG not on loyalty alone, but on layers. Redundancies. Informants watching informants. Lieutenants who reported not just to him, but to separate chains of command designed to ensure that no one man ever held enough power to threaten the center. It was a structure born of paranoia. And paranoia, in this world, is simply another word for survival. So when the rumors spread, El Mencho did something unexpected. He said nothing. He issued no denials, no videos, no public messages through his network of narco banners and social media operatives. Just silence. And that silence, according to analysts who study cartel psychology, was its own kind of test. Because silence invites action. It invites the ambitious to reveal themselves. It invites the disloyal to make the first move. And El Mencho, even weakened, even confined to whatever location he was being treated in. He was watching, waiting, taking names. Not everyone understood this. Some saw the silence as confirmation of the rumors. Proof that the old man had finally lost his grip. They saw opportunity. They saw a throne that might soon be empty. They saw a future where they could rise, if only they moved first. And one of them did. According to reports that would later be corroborated by multiple intelligence sources, someone inside El Mencho's organization made contact with an outside faction during this period of uncertainty. Not a rival cartel. Something more dangerous. An ally. A partner. Someone who had access to routes, to safe houses, to the inner workings of CGNG logistics, and who had begun to wonder whether their future lay with a dying king or with those who might replace him. The betrayal was not immediate. It was careful, calculated. The kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself. It positions itself. A conversation here. A shared piece of information there. Nothing that could be traced. Nothing that could be proven. Just enough to build a bridge to the other side. Just enough to ensure survival if the empire fell. But El Mencho's empire was built on one principle above all others. There is no other side. You are with him, completely, irrevocably, unto death. Or you are already dead. You just don't know it yet. The person who made that first contact believed they were being careful. They believed they were invisible. They believed that a dying man couldn't see what was happening in the shadows of his own house. They were wrong. Because El Mencho wasn't just watching the outside. He was watching the inside. And the names were already being written. In the cartel world, there is no such thing as a secret. Only delayed information. Every word spoken in a backroom eventually finds its way to someone who shouldn't hear it. Every handshake made in shadow leaves a trace. Every promise whispered to a rival, no matter how carefully, carries a signature. And El Mencho had spent decades learning how to read those signatures. According to investigators who later reconstructed the events, the betrayal didn't begin with a dramatic act. There was no moment of open defiance. No declaration of independence. It began with a phone call. A single phone call made from a disposable device in the outskirts of Guadalajara to a number registered in another state. A number associated with a faction that CGNG had, until recently, considered an ally of convenience. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. But in those 4 minutes, something shifted. A door opened. And once certain doors open in this world, they can never be closed again. The caller, according to intelligence sources, was not a low-level operative. This wasn't some desperate foot soldier looking for an exit strategy. This was someone with access. Real access. The kind of access that comes from years of proximity to power. Years of being trusted. Years of sitting in rooms where routes were discussed, where names were spoken, where the architecture of the empire was laid bare. Reports suggest this individual held a logistics role within CGNG's Western Corridor, a position that required direct coordination with El Mencho's most trusted lieutenants. a position that required knowing things most people within the organization would never learn. And that knowledge, it seems, had become currency. The first piece of information shared was small. A route, a timing, the kind of operational detail that, on its own, might seem insignificant. But it wasn't insignificant. It was a test, a demonstration of access, a proof of value. The message was clear: I have more. And I can give you more. If the price is right. If the protection is guaranteed. According to intercepted communications later analyzed by Mexican intelligence, the response from the other side was cautious but interested. They didn't trust the caller. Not yet, but they recognized opportunity when it presented itself. If El Mencho was truly weakened, if the rumors of his illness were accurate, then having an asset inside CJNG could be invaluable. Not for war, for positioning, for knowing when to move, for being ready when the throne became vacant. And so the relationship continued. Carefully, quietly, invisibly, or so the betrayer believed. What this individual failed to understand was the nature of the system El Mencho had built. CJNG was not a traditional hierarchy where information flowed in clean, predictable lines. It was a web, a mesh of overlapping networks designed specifically to catch moments like this. Lieutenants reported to multiple handlers. Couriers were tracked by people they didn't know existed. Communications, even encrypted ones, passed through filters controlled by specialists whose only job was to listen for anomalies. And an anomaly had been detected. Investigators believe the first red flag was raised not by surveillance technology, but by human observation. Someone noticed a change in behavior, a pattern disruption. Perhaps the betrayer was more cautious than usual. Perhaps they were less cautious. Perhaps they asked a question that didn't fit their role, or failed to ask a question they normally would. In this world, such things are noticed. And once noticed, they are reported. The report made its way through the chain, slowly at first, then faster as details were cross-referenced. A phone number that didn't match known devices. A meeting that couldn't be accounted for. A shipment that arrived late in a way that suggested someone had known when not to be there. Each piece alone was circumstantial. Together, they formed a picture. And that picture eventually reached the one person who had final authority on such matters. El Mencho. According to sources who later spoke to journalists covering cartel dynamics, El Mencho's reaction was not what anyone expected. No rage. No shouting. No immediate order for violence. Instead, silence. Days of silence. The kind of silence that makes men who think they're safe begin to feel the walls closing in, even when nothing has visibly changed. Because El Mencho understood something that the betrayer did not. Speed is not strength. Patience is strength. A reaction is expected. A reaction can be anticipated, prepared for, escaped from. But a delayed response that comes when you've already convinced yourself you're safe, that is inescapable. If you're watching this, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who appreciates real narratives of power and consequence. Drop a comment with the time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. I want to know who's out there following this journey. The betrayer continued their communications for almost 2 more weeks. They believed they were building a bridge to safety. They believed they were positioning themselves for the transition of power that would surely come when El Mencho finally succumbed to whatever illness was consuming him. They believed time was on their side. But time in El Mencho's world is not a neutral force. Time is a resource, and he was using it, gathering names, confirming connections, mapping the full extent of the betrayal, not just the who, but the what. Not just the source, but the destination. Not just the traitor, but everyone the traitor had touched. Because when the response finally came, it would not be aimed at one person. It would be aimed at a network. And networks, once exposed, can be dismantled entirely. The betrayer didn't know it yet, but their bridge to safety had become a trap. And the man they thought was dying was very much awake. Watching. Waiting. Ready to send a message that would remind everyone, inside his organization and out, what happens to those who mistake silence for absence. The names had been written. Now it was time to deliver the consequences. There was no phone call, no encrypted message, no video recorded in a shadowed room with a distorted voice. When Mencho finally decided to respond, he chose the oldest method of communication in the cartel world. Paper, handwritten, and signed. According to intelligence reports that surfaced months later, the order was written on a single sheet. No letterhead, no identifying marks. The handwriting, according to analysts who studied photographs of similar documents, was steady, controlled. The penmanship of a man who was not rushed. A man who had taken his time. A man who wanted the recipient to understand that this was not impulse. This was judgment. The contents of that note have never been fully disclosed. But investigators believe it contained 3 elements. Names. Locations. A single word at the bottom, a word that, in CJNG's internal vocabulary, carried absolute and irreversible meaning. The word was never leaked. It didn't need to be. The results spoke for themselves. The note was not delivered directly. That would have been too simple, too traceable. Instead, according to sources familiar with cartel communication protocols, it passed through 3 separate couriers, each one knowing only their portion of the chain. Each one selected for absolute loyalty. Each one aware that their own life depended on the message reaching its destination without interception. The first courier received the note from a location that has never been confirmed. Some reports suggest a private medical facility in Jalisco. Others point to a fortified ranch in the highlands. What matters is not where the note originated, but that it moved through the system like a ghost. Invisible. Untraceable. Inevitable. The second courier received the note in a parking lot outside a shopping center in Zapopan. The exchange took less than 10 seconds. No words spoken. No eye contact made. Just a folded piece of paper passing from one hand to another. The third courier, the one who would deliver the message to its final recipient, was a woman. According to reports, she was someone who had worked within CGNG's financial infrastructure for years. Not a soldier. Not someone who would ever be suspected of carrying operational directives. She was invisible in plain sight. And that was precisely the point. The final recipient was one of Mencho's most senior operational commanders, a man who controlled a significant portion of CJNG's enforcement apparatus across multiple states. A man whose loyalty had been tested many times. A man who understood, the moment he unfolded that piece of paper, that the rumors of Mencho's weakness had been gravely mistaken. Investigators believe the commander read the note twice. Then he burned it. Then he made 3 phone calls, each one to a different cell operating in different regions. The calls lasted less than a minute each. When he hung up the last one, the machinery of consequence had been set in motion. And here is where the story becomes something more than a tale of cartel violence. Because what happened next was not chaos. It was not the kind of indiscriminate bloodshed that rival organizations often engage in during moments of internal conflict. It was precision, surgical, silent. According to security analysts who later reviewed the events, there were no public confrontations, no shootouts in the streets, No bodies left hanging from bridges with narco messages attached. Those tactics, the theatrical displays of power, belong to organizations that need to prove themselves. El Mencho had nothing to prove. He simply needed to remove a problem. And removal, in his philosophy, does not require an audience. The betrayer vanished first. One day they were present, attending meetings, maintaining routines, continuing their careful communications with the outside faction. The next day they were simply gone. No witnesses. No struggle. No trace. Their contacts vanished next. Not simultaneously. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they disappeared one by one, over the course of 72 hours, in a pattern so methodical that investigators would later describe it as choreographed. A financial associate in Colima who had facilitated certain transfers. A logistics coordinator in Manzanillo who had asked too many questions. A relative of the betrayer who had served as an intermediary without fully understanding what they were involved in. Each one removed. Each one silent. Each one erased as if they had never existed. The message was clear, not just to those who disappeared, but to everyone who remained. El Mencho sees. El Mencho waits. El Mencho remembers. And when El Mencho acts, there is no warning. No negotiation. No second chance. Only consequence. What made this particular response so effective was not its brutality. Brutality is common in the cartel world. It is expected. It is, in many ways, unremarkable. What made this response different was its restraint. There were no public statements. No videos posted to social media accounts claiming credit. No narco banners hung in plazas declaring victory over traitors. Just silence. The same silence that had preceded the order. The same silence that had allowed the betrayer to believe they were safe. Now that silence had a new meaning. It meant the matter was closed. It meant the organization had been cleansed. It meant that anyone who had considered similar acts of disloyalty should understand, without being told directly, what awaited them. According to reports from journalists who cover cartel dynamics, the effect on CGNG's internal structure was immediate. The hesitation that had begun to spread during El Mencho's rumored illness evaporated. The mid-level operators who had started exploring alternatives suddenly became models of loyalty. The plaza bosses who had stopped answering calls from Guadalajara started answering on the first ring. One order, handwritten, delivered through ghosts. And the empire was reminded who controlled it. But the story does not end there. Because the names on that note, the names that El Mencho had written in his steady, unhurried hand, did not only include those who had betrayed him. There was one more name. One name that, according to intelligence sources, shocked even the most senior members of the organization. A name no one had expected. A name that revealed the true cost of El Mencho's dying order. The clock started at midnight. Not literally. Investigators would never be able to pinpoint the exact moment the operation began. But symbolically, that is how those who later studied the events came to understand it. Midnight. The hour when the world sleeps. The hour when consequences arrive. According to Mexican intelligence analysts who reconstructed the timeline from fragmentary reports, intercepted communications, and witness accounts that surfaced months later, the 72 hours that followed El Mencho's order represented one of the most coordinated internal actions in modern cartel history. Not a war. Wars are loud. Wars are visible. Wars leave wreckage that can be photographed and analyzed. This was something else. This was a cleansing. And cleansings, when done correctly, leave almost nothing behind. The first disappearance occurred in Guadalajara. A man, mid-40s, unremarkable appearance, known to associates as a logistics coordinator for CJNG's Western Corridor, left his apartment at approximately 6:15 a.m. to purchase coffee from a vendor he visited every morning. He never reached the vendor. Surveillance footage from a nearby business showed him walking north on a residential street. 40 seconds later, he passed out of frame. He was never seen on any camera again. No vehicle was observed. No confrontation was recorded. He simply ceased to exist. The second disappearance occurred 14 hours later. A woman in Colima, believed by investigators to be a financial intermediary who had facilitated certain transactions connected to the betrayal, failed to arrive at a family gathering. Her car was found parked at a shopping center 3 kilometers from her home. The engine was cold. Her phone was inside, powered off. Her purse was on the passenger seat, untouched. Nothing was taken. Nothing was disturbed. She was simply gone. By the 36-hour mark, the pattern had become undeniable. 6 individuals connected to the original betrayer had vanished. Not killed in public. Not left as warnings. Vanished. And this, according to analysts who study cartel methodology, was the most chilling aspect of the operation. In the cartels, death is often theatrical. Bodies are displayed. Messages are written. Fear is generated through spectacle. But El Mencho's order had demanded something different. Not spectacle. Erasure. Because erasure carries its own message. When a body is displayed, it becomes a symbol. It can be mourned. It can be avenged. It becomes part of a narrative that others can use. But when someone simply disappears, when there is no body, no grave, no confirmation, they become something worse than deceased. They become a question, a permanent, unanswerable question that haunts everyone who knew them. What happened? Where did they go? Could it happen to me? Investigators believe this was intentional. El Mencho did not want martyrs. He did not want symbols that rivals could rally around. He wanted absence. The kind of absence that fills a room with silence whenever someone mentions the missing name. The kind of absence that makes men check their phones more often, sleep less soundly, speak more carefully. The kind of absence that reminds everyone, the organization is always watching. By the 48-hour mark, the disappearances had spread beyond Jalisco. An associate in Zacatecas, someone who had attended the unauthorized meeting in Tijuana weeks earlier, stopped responding to communications. A courier in Michoacan who had carried messages between the betrayer and external contacts was reported missing by family members. A businessman in Leon who had provided logistical support for certain off-the-books shipments closed his office and was never seen again. The precision was remarkable. Each target was connected to the betrayal, either directly or through secondary contact. Each target was removed without witnesses. Each target vanished within a window that made coincidence impossible. And yet, according to all available reports, there was no panic within CJNG. No internal chaos. No visible disruption to operations. The organization continued to function. Shipments moved. Territory was maintained. Business proceeded as normal. Because that was the point. The cleansing was not meant to destabilize. It was meant to stabilize by removing instability at its source. Those who remained understood the message without being told. The operation was surgical. It targeted only those who had compromised the organization. If you were loyal, if you had kept your silence, maintained your discipline, honored your commitment, you had nothing to fear. But if you had wavered, if you had whispered, if you had, even for a moment, considered a future without El Mencho, then you understood that such thoughts carried weight. And that weight could, at any moment, become a disappearance. By the 72-hour mark, the operation was complete. According to estimates from security analysts, between 8 and 12 individuals had been removed. No public statements were issued. No rival organizations claimed involvement. No law enforcement agencies announced investigations. Just silence. The same silence that had characterized El Mencho's leadership for years. The silence of a man who does not need to explain his actions. The silence of absolute authority. But the 72 hours had revealed something else. Something that even senior CJNG commanders had not anticipated. Among the names that had vanished, among the logistics coordinators and financial intermediaries and couriers, there was one name that did not fit the pattern. One name that should have been untouchable. One name that suggested El Mencho's order had not only been about punishing betrayal. It had been about sending a message so personal, so unexpected, that it would resonate far beyond the borders of his organization. The name was not leaked to the press. Intelligence agencies kept it classified for months. But within CJNG, within the inner circles that had access to such information, the name was known. And its inclusion on El Mencho's list changed everything. Because this name was not an enemy. This name was not a traitor in the traditional sense. This name was family. In the cartel world, there are rules. Unwritten. Unspoken. But absolute. You do not touch family. You do not threaten bloodlines. You do not bring consequence to the dinner table where children eat and mothers pray. These rules exist not out of morality. Morality is a luxury few in this world can afford, but out of practicality. Because once family becomes a target, everything unravels. Loyalty dissolves. Alliances collapse. The very foundation of trust that holds these organizations together crumbles into paranoia and chaos. El Mencho understood this better than anyone. He had built CJNG on family. His wife. His children. His extended network of relatives who occupied positions throughout the organization. Some visible, some hidden, all bound by blood to the empire he had constructed. Family was the core. Family was sacred. Family was untouchable. Until it wasn't. According to intelligence sources who later pieced together the events, the final name on El Mencho's list was not a logistics coordinator or a financial intermediary. It was not someone who had made phone calls to rival factions or shared operational details with outside parties. It was someone far closer. Someone whose betrayal cut deeper than territory or money or strategic advantage. Someone who had violated the most fundamental principle of El Mencho's world. Absolute loyalty to the bloodline. The name, according to reports that emerged months after the 72-hour operation, belonged to a relative. Not a distant cousin. Not a peripheral connection. A relative by marriage. Someone who had entered the family through union with one of El Mencho's trusted inner circle. Someone who had been welcomed, protected, elevated, given access that outsiders could never dream of. And someone who had used that access to build a bridge to the other side. Investigators believe this individual had grown disillusioned. Perhaps they had seen too much. Perhaps they had grown tired of the constant tension, the unending threat of law enforcement, the knowledge that every day could be the day everything collapsed. Perhaps they had simply made a calculation, a cold, rational assessment that El Mencho's illness represented an opportunity to secure their own future before the empire fell. Whatever the reason, they had reached out. Quietly, carefully, using their position within the family to access information that no outside operative could ever obtain. They knew safe houses. They knew travel patterns. They knew the names of doctors who treated El Mencho. They knew details that, if shared with the wrong people, could bring the entire organization crashing down. And they had begun to share. According to sources familiar with cartel dynamics, the betrayal was discovered not through surveillance or intercepted communications, but through something far more old-fashioned. Observation. A trusted lieutenant noticed inconsistencies. Questions asked at odd moments. Absences that couldn't be explained. A nervousness that hadn't existed before. The kind of subtle shifts in behavior that only someone paying close attention would detect. The lieutenant reported his concerns through the proper channels. The concerns were investigated, and the investigation led to a conclusion that no one wanted to believe. The betrayer was family. When the evidence was presented to Mencho, according to accounts that would later circulate among those with knowledge of the inner workings, he did not react immediately. He listened. He reviewed. He asked questions, careful, precise questions designed to eliminate any possibility of error. Because this was not a decision that could be made lightly. This was not a logistics coordinator who could be replaced. This was blood, or as close to blood as marriage allows. And yet, the evidence was clear. The betrayal was real. The threat was active. According to sources, Mencho spent nearly 2 days in deliberation. 2 days of silence. 2 days during which the normal flow of orders and directives slowed to almost nothing. 2 days during which senior commanders wondered if the rumors of his illness had finally caught up with reality. But Mencho was not weakened. He was deciding, weighing, measuring the cost of action against the cost of inaction. Because if he did nothing, if he allowed family to betray and escape consequence, then the message would be clear. Blood protects. Blood exempts. Blood creates a shield that even the most serious violations cannot penetrate. And if that message spread, the entire structure of loyalty he had built would begin to erode. Others would test the boundaries. Others would assume that closeness to the family meant safety. Others would betray, knowing that the worst they might face was exile rather than erasure. Mencho could not allow that. According to reports, the name was added to the list on the final night before the order was delivered. Written in the same steady hand. Placed among the other names as if it were no different. As if blood carried no special weight. As if the decision had been simple. It was not simple. Investigators who later analyzed the psychological dimensions of this moment believe it was one of the most difficult decisions Mencho had ever made. Not because he doubted the evidence, but because he understood what it meant. It meant that no one was safe. It meant that loyalty was not assumed, it was proven. It meant that the organization existed above individuals, above relationships, above even the family bonds that had given it strength. And it meant that Mencho himself was willing to pay the personal cost of that principle. When the 72 hours concluded, the family member was gone. No public statement. No explanation offered to those who wondered. Just absence. The same absence that had claimed the logistics coordinators and financial intermediaries and couriers. The same silence that had followed every other name on the list. But within CGNG, the message was understood. Whispered in private. Acknowledged in glances. Never spoken aloud, but never forgotten. If Mencho would sacrifice family, he would sacrifice anyone. If Mencho would erase blood, he would erase strangers without hesitation. If Mencho was willing to bear that weight, then challenging him was not ambition. It was extinction. The empire had been tested, and the empire had responded. Not with weakness, not with sentiment, but with the cold, absolute calculus of power. Mencho's dying order had not only eliminated traitors, it had redefined the rules of the game itself. And those rules were simple. There is no exemption. There is no protection. There is only loyalty. Or there is nothing. In the weeks that followed, something unusual happened. Nothing. No retaliation from rival factions. No internal power struggles. No fractured alliances or breakaway cells declaring independence. Just silence. The same silence that had characterized the 72 hours of consequence. The same silence that had become El Mencho's signature. According to Mexican security analysts who monitored cartel activity during this period, the absence of chaos was itself remarkable. In most organizations, an internal purge of this magnitude would trigger instability. Lieutenants would question their own safety. Factions would form. Rivals would sense opportunity and probe for weakness. But none of that happened. CGNG continued to operate with the same discipline it had maintained for years. Shipments moved through established corridors. Territory remained under firm control. The machinery of the empire ground forward without interruption. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful message of all. El Mencho's dying order had not weakened the organization. It had strengthened it. By demonstrating that consequences were absolute, that no one, regardless of position or blood, was exempt from judgment, he had reinforced the very foundation of his power. Fear. Not chaotic fear. Not the fear of random violence. But calculated fear. The fear of certainty. The knowledge that actions have consequences and that those consequences will arrive. Not in rage, not in haste, but in the fullness of time, delivered with precision and finality. Investigators who study cartel psychology noted a shift in CGNG's internal dynamics following the 72 hours. Communication protocols tightened. Operational security increased. The casual conversations that had begun to emerge during El Mencho's rumored illness disappeared entirely. No one spoke of succession anymore. No one speculated about what might happen if the leader fell. Because everyone understood, without being told, that the leader had not fallen. And that speculation itself carried risk. The rival faction that had received communications from the betrayer also went quiet. According to intercepted intelligence, their leadership held emergency meetings in the days following the disappearances. The agenda was simple: assess exposure. How much had they revealed during their conversations with the CGNG turncoat? How much did El Mencho now know about their operations? How vulnerable were they to a counterstrike? The answers, it seems, were troubling enough to prompt a strategic withdrawal. Certain operations were paused. Certain personnel were relocated. Certain ambitions were quietly shelved. El Mencho had not only cleansed his own organization, he had paralyzed his rivals with uncertainty. Because if he could identify and eliminate a betrayer within his own family, someone with access to his most protected secrets, then what else did he know? What other networks had been compromised? What other conversations had been monitored? The answer was unknowable. And in the cartel world, the unknowable is the most dangerous thing of all. According to reports from journalists who cover organized crime in Mexico, the months following the dying order saw a consolidation of CGNG's power across western Mexico. Territories that had been contested became firmly controlled. Alliances that had been uncertain became reliable. Competitors who had been aggressive became cautious. Not because El Mencho had launched an offensive. Not because CGNG had expanded through violence. But because the message had been received. The message was not about strength in the traditional sense. It was not about firepower or numbers or territorial conquest. It was about will. The will to make decisions that others would hesitate to make. The will to sacrifice what others would protect. The will to act when others would deliberate. El Mencho had demonstrated that his will remained intact. And in this world, will is the ultimate currency. As for El Mencho himself, the rumors of his illness did not disappear. Intelligence agencies continued to track reports of medical treatments, declining health, reduced mobility. Some believed he was operating from a single fortified location, unable to travel. Others suggested he had multiple treatment facilities across Jalisco, moving between them to avoid detection. The truth remained, as always, elusive. But one thing had become clear. Whatever his physical condition, his mind remained sharp. His authority remained absolute. His grip on the empire remained unbroken. The dying order had proven something that rivals, law enforcement, and even some within his own organization had begun to doubt. El Mencho did not need to stand to rule. He did not need to be seen to be present. He did not need to speak to be heard. A single piece of paper, a handful of names, 72 hours of silence, and the entire cartel world had been reminded who held power in Mexico. Investigators believe the consequences of this episode extended far beyond CJNG's internal dynamics. It influenced how other organizations approached negotiations. It affected law enforcement strategies. It shaped the decisions of politicians, businessmen, and community leaders across multiple states. Because power, in its purest form, is not about what you do. It is about what others believe you are capable of doing. And El Mencho, through his dying order, had expanded that belief to its absolute limit. He had shown that distance did not diminish his reach. He had shown that illness did not weaken his resolve. He had shown that family was not a shield, but a responsibility. And he had shown that silence, properly wielded, was more terrifying than any public display of force. Today, according to security analysts, CJNG remains one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. Its operations span multiple continents. Its influence reaches into legitimate businesses, political structures, and financial systems across the globe. And at its center, whether in a hospital bed, a fortified ranch, or somewhere that intelligence agencies have yet to identify, sits a man whose name is spoken in whispers. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. El Mencho, the man who gave an order from the edge of death, and reminded the world that empires are not built on territory. They are built on will. And his will, whatever the state of his body, remains unbroken. The throne is not vacant. The succession is not open. The empire remains.